From Quito, Ecuador, my name is Carla Gonzalez and this is From the South, the evening news brief on Telesur English. We begin this new edition right now. We begin in the Dominican Republic, where talks are underway again between the Venezuelan government and the opposition. Delegations from both sides arrived for the dialogue at the Foreign Ministry in Santo Domingo. The meeting is being hosted by the Dominican President Danilo Medina. Foreign ministers from Chile, Mexico, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines are all facilitating the talks. Government Representative Jorge Rodriguez said he hopes they can reach agreements for peaceful coexistence between the two sides.
Since May 2016, on more than 330 occasions, President Nicolás Maduro has called for dialogue. We don't know in how many sectors the opposition is divided into, but we have managed to get some to sit down and talk. I believe we have made progress in the 6 points that were presented. President Maduro sends a grateful message to the people of the Dominican Republic and the President Danilo Medina, his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Miguel Vargas. He also thanks the countries following the process, President José Luis Rodríguez Zapatero, and reiterates that we should seek a way to reach an agreement for peaceful coexistence in Venezuela.
Our correspondent in Caracas, Freddie Gillingham, is following the talks and sent us this report.
So the rescheduled dialogue between the Venezuelan government and the opposition resumed today in Santo Domingo, the capital of the Dominican Republic. This is, of course, a continuation of talks which were rescheduled earlier this month. There has been several stalled attempts to get these talks going, but they did commence today in the Dominican Republic. The foreign ministers of Bolivia, Mexico, Nicaragua and Chile were all present. The Venezuelan foreign minister, Jorge Arreaza, did release a statement yesterday urging for the success of these talks, where he said, I quote, "Hopefully we can guarantee in this space a coexistent agreement where a law is respected and where political violence is out of the game." This is, of course, hinting at the anti-government protests which engulfed the country throughout the summer. Some of the main points on the agenda today regarding the demands of the government, which they will be putting forward, is the setting up of a truth commission. This will be to establish an investigative approach to political orchestrated crimes in the country. The respect of the electoral process. This is, of course, comes after the municipal elections where the opposition, 3 of the main opposition parties boycotted that vote, and finally the recognition of the Constituent Assembly. That's all we have time for now. We will update you later on the findings of those demands in the Dominican Republic.
That was Frederick Gillingham from Caracas. Now in Cuba, the country has expressed once again its support towards Venezuela and its President Nicolás Maduro, this time during the ALBA Council's closing ceremony. The 11 nation members of ALBA rejected the sanctions imposed against the Bolivarian country by the United States, the European Union and Canada. President Maduro and his Cuban counterpart Raúl Castro attended the event, one that also commemorated the organization's 13th anniversary that has worked as a mechanism to integrate Latin America. The main opposition Libre Party in Honduras called its supporters onto the streets to protest fraud in last month's elections. They have been met with violent police repression. The protesters are blocking roads and burning tires in the capital, Tegucigalpa, and in other cities like San Pedro Sula. They want the removal of President Juan Orlando Hernández and a complete recount of all the ballot boxes.
We are protesting against fraud. We want them to count all the votes in the ballot boxes. This is what we want, and the people want. We've already won the elections. Now we want them to recount the votes that show that. But we don't want it done by Matamoros, the head of the TSE. He works for ULA.
We are in the street asking Juan Orlando Hernández to leave. Do you know why? Because 4 years ago he said that nobody was over the law. And this is what we are fighting for. We are telling Juan Orlando that we don't need him in the presidential house.
We tell you, Juan Orlando, leave the country, leave office, because me, on the first point, I didn't vote for you. I voted for my country's freedom, I voted for employment, for health, and not what we have now.
Our correspondent in Honduras, Heather Geese, told us more about the mood on the streets of Tegucigalpa.
So today a national strike was called, and these are not centralized mobilizations or marches like we've seen on other occasions. Instead, these are decentralized actions on main roads in certain neighborhoods. So the Opposition Alliance is reporting that protesters are participating in this national strike in every department of the country. There are dozens of road blockades and other occupations set up. Here in the capital, Tegucigalpa, there have been throughout the morning over 15 blockades from reports I've seen. A number of these were broken up early in the morning, but the main ones, which are at the exit and entry points of the city on the main roads leading to other cities, those are still being maintained by protesters. There are also some reports of repression from police and military forces. Some of the blockades have been removed with tear gas and a crackdown involving protesters being beaten. And in other places, the repression has been much more forceful. There are reports from certain areas in the northern part of the country where security forces actually used live bullets on protesters, specifically one case in a city called Villanueva in the department of FtS. This is one of the strong forces opened fire with live bullets. So there are a number of protests still going on. These are decentralized protests all across the country, but we're seeing that the police and military repression is also cracking down.
Puerto Rico usually receives more than 5 million visitors a year. However, 2 months after Hurricane Maria battered the island, tourists are still a rare sight. Tourism peak season in Puerto Rico provided jobs for around 80,000 people. Once popular tours on the eastern coast of the island are now deserted, and most of the restaurants are closed. The exceptions are for the restaurants that replaced their dwindling tourism business with a rise in demand from local residents.
Local customers that don't have light at home. We have a generator and cold goods and food. A lot of people come to eat here and don't have to go queue in the supermarket because we have food already prepared.
3 months after 2 Category 5 hurricanes devastated many parts of the Caribbean, thousands of children across the region still need support, according to the United Nations Children's Fund. UNICEF estimates that both Hurricane Irma and Maria have left some 350,000 children in need of humanitarian assistance. In Dominica, 35% of the children are still not enrolled in educational activities. While in Antigua and Barbuda, many families remain in shelters, unable to return home. We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Mexico's Congress has approved a law that enshrines the use of the army in the country's war against drug cartels, despite protests from the United Nations and activists who fear overreaching military power.
When the armed forces take to the streets, we will be in a permanent state of emergency by law. This is wholly unconstitutional, and it will be a law passed by the Supreme Tribunal. But what worries us the most is that by putting the Army and the Navy in this position, entities that guard our country's sovereignty and must be protected, we will permanently deteriorate said sovereignty. This law is also an attack on human rights. We already have complaints from different international organizations, such as the UN, which has warned us that this law is taking us in the opposite direction from the rest of the world.
The Argentine government is preparing a decree to pass its pension reform, after the Congress had to suspend its debate on the law because of protest and violent repression outside. More details in the next report.
Workers from across the country mobilized in Buenos Aires to try and stop the pension reform law. The march arrived outside of Congress, which was guarded by a strong security presence. About 3,500 state security forces violently repressed the social protest, creating chaos and confusion among the Congress representatives.
We never expected such violent repression. We demand the security operation be stopped so that we can continue with today's session in peace. That's all we want.
We have a militarized Congress. It reminds us of last year's events, which are very sad for our history.
During the protests, hundreds of retired citizens accused the government to take adjustment measures only to generate more hunger and poverty.
How is it possible that they're going to take $5 billion from pensioners' pockets? This is a huge robbery. They're harming poor people because now they're going to make you retire at the age of 80.
Numerous protesters were injured by tear gas and rubber bullets. However, this didn't stop them to stand against the new regulation policies and social rights violations established by President Mauricio Macri.
A militarized Congress. It is an atrocious image. This violent repression against pensioners and workers who have marched outside Congress is like kidnapping our democracy. It's a message to the people that every time they want to raise their voices, there will be rubber bullets and tear gas.
The Congress session to debate the pension reform law has failed. The next couple of days will be difficult for the Argentine people. Labor unions reject these reforms, which try to deepen the neoliberal economic and social models. Workers announced that they will be protesting on the streets to protect their achievements obtained over the last couple of years.
The Argentine indigenous leader and lawmaker Milagros Sala is being transferred back to a form of house arrest. Sala is expected to be taken from prison to the house at El Carmen, where she was previously under house arrest. Restrictions will be placed on the visits that she can receive. The Tupac Amaru leader has already been absolved in the cases against her, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights has ruled that she should be released by today. The Workers' Party in Brazil is launching a campaign to support Lula da Silva's presidential campaign. Our correspondent André Vieira has more details.
The Workers' Party is in Sao Paulo to launch a campaign in favor of democracy and to promote Lula da Silva's presidential nomination. This is taking place after Brazil's Justice Department opened a case against the former president, which already has a trial date. If Lula is sentenced, he will automatically have to abandon the presidential race. According to several social organizations and experts, this case against Lula da Silva is political persecution because there is no evidence to accuse him. The Justice Department is accusing him of receiving an apartment as bribe from a Brazilian construction business, although his lawyers have proven this never happened and actually this property is in the hands of a public bank in Brazil. Social organizations will put together a committee to defend Lula's candidacy. A new poll that was just released shows that 56% of Brazilians want Lula at the presidential race. On his part, Lula has denounced the justice persecution as he thinks this is a way to prevent his nomination.
André Vieira from Brazil. Now on Thursday marked a victorious day for social movements in Brazil, with a defeat for President Michel Temer. A key debate on his proposed pension reforms, due to be voted next week, has been postponed until February 2018. More details in the next report from our correspondents André Vieira and Sebastián Soto.
Without any discussion in Parliament and with a lot of popular pressure, the vote for the reform of the pension system proposed by the government of Michel Temer was postponed until February. On early Thursday, social movements called for a press conference in Rio de Janeiro to denounce the consequences of Temer's policies and to express solidarity with the 10 people on hunger strike because of the reforms. In light of the postponed vote, the 10-day hunger strike has been stopped for now.
It's very bad. Very few people get to retire. This is one of the cruelest reforms from the coup government of Michel Temer. There was recently the labor reform, but this one is the worst, without a doubt.
Worker Marcos, like all men, can only retire at 65 years old. Currently, they need to contribute for 35 years and there's no minimum age to access this benefit.
Until we reach that age, we don't know if we're going to be alive or receiving some money. We don't know what to do with our lives.
Michel Temer's policies also affects women. Senalba is 47 years old and she could retire in 8 years given her 22-year contribution to Social Security. With this new regulation, she will have to work 16 more years because today women need to contribute for 30 years and there's no minimum age. With Temer's reform, women will have to work until 62 to be able to retire.
He doesn't want to retire at that age and pretends to do the same with the population, to kill the populations as slaves, because we will work and never retire.
The situation is a concern for those close to retirement, but it's even worse for young people because the country is currently in financial and political crisis in which expectations of employment are very low, with over 13 million workers unemployed.
The government doesn't have legitimacy to do this, and that's why they're pushing hard for these pension reforms. Middle education, free transportation. They're running to ruin everything until next year.
With only 3% of approval of his government and facing strong rejection from the population, Michel Temer won't be able to approve his pension reforms. For next year, social movements have promised to resist and they warn that they will not allow this neoliberal policy to go through.
Congress in Peru has initiated the process to impeach President Pedro Pablo Kucynski following corruption allegations in the Odebrecht scandal. Opposition lawmakers presented the motion on Friday demanding that he resign for, quote, moral incapacity, with Congress President Luis Galarreta saying that Kucynski could be removed from office within a week. If that happens, Vice President Martín Vizcarra would take over under constitutional rules. Also related to Odebrecht, Vice President of Ecuador Jorge Glass could face a political trial after a commission of the National Assembly set the debate for Sunday 17th. The President of the Assembly, José Serrano, said they will analyze all the information presented and decide whether to go forward with the trial, which will remove Glass as Vice President of Ecuador. During a previous session, the lawmakers gave a 3-day limit to the head of the opposition party, Creo, which had requested the process. On Wednesday, the National Court sentenced Glass to 6 years in prison for criminal association. Chile's presidential runoff election on Sunday is likely to be decided by a small margin. Both the presidential candidates, Sebastián Piñera and Alejandro Guillier, have closed their campaigns. Chile's billionaire conservative presidential candidate, Sebastián Piñera, a former president himself, heads into a tighter-than-expected race with center-left senator and journalist Alejandro Guillier. Both the candidates entered their campaigns by promising the voters better governance.
I apologize to my compatriots for the errors that we have, without a doubt, committed, and I feel that today we have a better program, better teams, a clearer mission, and we are better prepared.
I've got a dream for the country that I shared with you. I want a Chile without abuse nor collusion. I want a Chile where everybody's rights are respected, where the diverse Chilean families can fully develop, where the children are happy, while the elderly have decent pensions.
Bolivia's President Evo Morales has wished Chileans luck in their presidential elections. Speaking in Rome on a visit to the Vatican, he had this to say.
I wish Chile much luck. We hope that Sunday is a democratic celebration for the Chilean people. Bolivia, respecting the Constitution of the Union of South American Nations, that we respect regardless of the differences in ideological character. This is also due to my meeting with the presidents of Latin America. How good it would be to have good relations with whomever wins in Chile. I come from a culture of dialogue.
The Bolivian president met with the Pope in the Vatican City's Apostolic Palace. Following this meeting, Morales tweeted, "His reflections on the poorest, his prayers for peace and against injustice are worth thinking about. The encounter with Brother Pope gives me more strength and commitment to those most in need. 5 children in Colombia died due to lack of food and social welfare in the area of Guajira. This is a humanitarian crisis that affects the lives of thousands of people who live in that department located in the north. 16 children from the Wayu indigenous community died due to hunger and medical attention in the region in 2017. The doctors in the area have denounced this situation on multiple occasions and have requested that the Colombian government finds a solution to avoid the loss of innocent lives. Colombia's health deputy minister said the direct cause of death wasn't chronic malnutrition. But the citizens of Guajira say corruption, the money they're not receiving from mineral exploitation in the area, and the lack of political will by the state are among the structural causes of this crisis. The Havana International Latin American Film Festival has been a cultural and artistic landmark for decades. Let's learn more about this event, which is now underway for the 39th year running.
Once again, Havana is like a great movie. People discussing scripts, lights, cinematography, sound or acting. The Cuban capital is, during 10 days, the center of the new Latin American cinema. Audiences jump from room to room, using the best of their time to see as many films as possible.
I just saw the movie, El Cigala. It's very beautiful, very pretty. And other people are debating about other Latin American and foreign movies, so this becomes a cultural and social event in which people debate, talk and critique.
The presence of Diego El Cigala in Havana has been one of the highlights of the festival. The Spanish flamenco singer presented here the documentary called Indestructible, The Soul of Salsa. The production shows a journey through the history of this musical genre that started in Cuba and then included regions like Colombia, New York, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic and Miami.
Lo bueno que tiene esto de la salsa y de haber podido hacer esa elección.
What's great about salsa is to have been able to make that selection from Héctor Orcheo Feliciano. It has been like bringing the greatest back without leaving flamenco, because otherwise these geniuses would have been there anyways.
For Colombian filmmaker Jaime Osorio, one of the features of this event is that movies go over the conflicts and concerns of Latin American people. He came to the festival to present his film Seven Heads, a movie he defines as full of tension and dark as he reflects on human violence.
Ser cineasta latinoamericano implica una responsabilidad, y esa responsabilidad es hablar sobre lo que sucede.
Being a Latin American filmmaker implies a responsibility, and that responsibility is to talk about what's happening in our countries. The most unequal, violent and contaminated. When you have the opportunity to make a film, well, it's a microphone to talk to those who have to make decisions, assuming this with great responsibility.
This film, called The Fourth Company, is among the most acclaimed by audiences. The feature took 10 years to film and had as subject the real prisons in Mexico. It has 20 nominations from the Mexican Academy of Sciences and Art. Through fiction and investigation, the documentary is a critical look at the Mexican penitentiary system.
El 70% de las cárceles ahora en México tienen lo que le llamamos el autogobierno.
70% of prisons in Mexico have what they call a self-government, which means that jails are co-administered with the penitentiary authority, and that brings a lot of issues within the penitentiary system. Then our movie is a portrait of an old story from the 70s, but that still has that relevance. That's why our film is a catalyst for a public conversation about this.
The Latin American countries with the biggest presence in this film festival are Argentina, Mexico, Cuba, Brazil and Chile. This year, 19 fiction features, 18 first words and 23 documentaries will compete for the Coral Award, among other genres.
We'll be back very soon. Stay with us. Israeli troops have shot dead 4 people and wounded 160 Palestinians with live fire in the latest violence that erupted in different parts of Palestine. Amongst those killed was a wheelchair-bound 21-year-old man, Ibrahim Abu Turaya, with no legs, who was shot along with another man during a demonstration near the border in the Gaza Strip. 2 other protesters were killed in the West Bank. And thousands of Palestinians have been protesting in a continuous wave of demonstrations since the US President Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital a week ago. Our correspondent in Palestine, Sergio Rodrigo, tells us more about what is happening on the ground.
Muy buenas tardes. Las protestas en Palestina.
The Israeli military continues to repress the protests taking place in Palestine. Several have been injured a week after the Friday of Rage took place last week, the third intifada, supported by a great number of Palestinians, that have taken to the streets to reject the United States President Donald Trump's announcement to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Protesters insist that this decision breaks the Oslo agreements and are demanding the end of the Israeli occupation. They say they are protesting for a solution that will respect their right to self-determination, while they continue to endure the atrocities committed by the Israeli militia.
That was Sergio Rodriguez from West Bank. Now let's take a look at our World News Roundup.
A Russian court has sentenced ex-economy minister Alexei Ulukayev to 8 years in prison after finding him guilty of taking a $2 million bribe from Igor Sechin, the CEO of oil giant Rosneft. The court also ruled that Ulukayev must pay a fine of more than $2 million. Ulukayev is the highest-ranking official arrested in Putin's 17 years in power. The leaders of the EU have agreed to move Brexit talks onto the second phase after meeting in Brussels. Talks will now move on to the long-term relationship between the UK and the EU, focusing on a transition period and a trading relationship for the future.
And we'll talk about moving on from phase 1 to phase 2, talking about the transition period and the new relationship that will exist between the EU and the UK. I think a lot of thinking needs to be done about that. There does seem to be quite divergent opinions on what that should look like. Needless to say, from an Irish point of view, we'd like it to look as much like the current relationship as possible, but that wouldn't necessarily be the view of everyone.
An election in Catalonia will fail to conclusively resolve a political crisis over an independence drive in the region. This is according to the final polls before the December 21st vote. Former Catalan leader Charles Puigdemont is campaigning from Brussels, where he moved shortly after he was fired by Madrid, following a unilateral declaration of independence by the region. A second batch of refugees who had been evacuated from Libya by the United Nations UNHCR refugee agency have arrived in Nigeria as part of efforts to resettle asylum seekers whose requests have been examined directly in Africa. The move fits into a United Nations strategy to provide protection for refugees and other vulnerable migrants who attempt to travel to Libya, often intending to make the dangerous sea crossing to Italy. The Tivoli amusement park in central Copenhagen, Denmark, has been dressed up for Christmas with 1 million lights and festive decorations. Visitors can now see a single tree covered in over 36,000 fairy lights. Rides and buildings have also been covered in lights. Christmas at Tivoli opened on November 18th and will run until December 31st.
And we've come to the end of this evening news brief. This and many other stories, you can find them on our website at telesurtv.net/English. And you can also join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.